A ver. Jo crec que sí, no? A veure que em trec la... Sí. La mascareta, no? Ai, que... Tinc por d'emportar-me el micro per davant. Hola. Vale. ¿Empezamos? Vinga. Bona tarda, benvinguts i moltes gràcies per estar aquí avui. Jo soc l'Eva Sòria i estem aquí avui amb el José Luis de Vicente, a la meva esquerra, i amb l'Oliver Grau. I d'aquí una estona ens connectarem amb la Cristiana i Paul des de Nova York per parlar de la relació entre art, ciència i tecnologia en nous contextos i formats. Jo volia començar explicant que a la taula rodona anterior, que ha sigut molt interessant, han parlat unes persones, la Mònica Bello, la Remedios Jafra i la Michelle Amargas, a més d'un dels ideòlegs, els directors d'arts electrònica, i he agafat algunes idees que trobo que són molt rellevants per a aquesta taula. La Mónica Bello ha dit que la ciencia se está abriendo al arte y la creatividad no es algo exclusivo del arte. I és una cosa que és molt rellevant, no? Pels que treballem en la intersecció entre l'art, la tecnologia i la societat, aquestes fronteres són molt etèries. Realment, cada cop la pràctica artística ens dona una visió molt clara que és molt negatiu i no s'ha de parlar d'art, tecnologia i societat com a coses separades, sinó que van totes juntes. La Remedios ha dit que pensar d'aquesta manera, dividint tant les disciplines, és com quan vas al metge i has d'anar o a l'oftalmòleg o al metge del peu o al metge dels ronyons, i que ningú et veu com una persona general i et veu com un humà. Doncs una mica la diferència entre art, tecnologia i societat i entre art i ciència és el mateix. Després, la Michelle ha dit que el bonic que està passant ara és que les disciplines, ella deia, they don't cancel each other out. És a dir, que aquestes disciplines no s'estan veient ja com l'art és el que il·lustra la ciència, sinó que l'art i la ciència fan una cosa junts, que és diferent i és nova. Començaré presentant l'Oliver Grau, que serà el primer ponent d'avui. Oliver és historiador, teòric de l'art i expert en art digital. És catedràtic de Ciències de la Imatge des de 2005. El seu llibre, que és molt conegut i que és un referent per tota la gent que ens interessa en aquests temes, és Virtual Art, From Illusion to Immersion. És publicat per l'MIT, més de 2.000 cites i la monografia d'història de l'art més esmentada des de l'any 2000. I les seves línies de recerca se centren en l'art mediàtic, les imatges immersives i, sobretot, l'art, l'emoció, la vida artificial i les humanitats digitals. Ell també és la persona que va desenvolupar el primer arxiu d'art digital, que es diu ADA, i algunes de les seves publicacions més recents són Imaginary in the 21st Century, també publicat per MIT, Museum and Archive on the Move, publicat el 2017, i el llibre més recent, que és Retracting Political Dimensions, del 2021. Té reconeixements varis, entre ells membre de l'Acadèmia Europea, i el 2019 va rebre el Premi Ciències de l'Estat de la Baixa Àustria. I sense més dilacions, li passo la paraula a l'Oliver perquè ens expliqui la seva visió de l'art.
Yeah, thank you so much for this wonderful introduction, and very happy to be here. Actually, this is my very first trip after Corona, and I see things are slowly restarting, and this is beautiful to be here in Barcelona to enjoy that, actually. And so the Corona pandemic has unmistakably shown how closely interconnected the world has become through globalization. Economically, technologically, and more culturally, life is often thematized by complex, I have also some slides here, okay. Can you see that already? Okay. By complex digital imagery, we discover what we may call now a political iconography of the 21st century. Artworks dealing with mega topics, with the big topics of our time, so like climate, evidently, like the image revolution, finance virtualization. Here you see a visualization of asymptote of the New York Stock Exchange, climate work dealing with climate by Bailey and others, and then also civilians, another very big topic of our time, here by Seiko Mikami, Desire of Codes. And I would say that digital art has the potential to deal with these big topics due to its large potential of visualization, more than evidently traditional art forms, and therefore it is so important for our democratic societies that we enable it to be shown in museums and so on. So it can take digital art, as we know, highly disparate forms. It includes genres like genetic, glitch, interactive installations, net art, and virtual reality art. However, this art is significantly lost due to the rapidly technological change. We may say that also the digital image is becoming ephemeral, experiential, immersive, interactive, multimodal, and processual, made out of numerous technologies. Media artists incorporate scientific methods into its construction and vice versa apply imaging methods in scientific research. The image has become a collaborative and ever-changing medium, and it's with its potential to deal and communicate the knowledge and also the emotional experience of those great new topics and issues I just mentioned. So, but artworks created just 10 years ago, for example, face a limitation unknown to that extent with older art media. They can often no longer be exhibited, although there are hundreds of festivals around the globe. Museums and libraries rarely include more complex media art in their collections, and those that do struggle to sustain, finance, expertise and technology for the preservation of artworks through strategies such as migration or emulation. And also the documentation of digital art was not much supported in the past, as expressed in the International Liverpool Declaration, signed by more than 450 scholars. You see a few of their names here, and museum heads from 40 countries. There's urgent need to overcome this limitation of knowledge and create a stable international platform of interoperable archives. And we started with IZEA, ZKM, Ars Electronica, and some other archives during the last festivals at IZEA and Fire Festival in Brazil. As research-oriented, and now I give you an expression for such an archive, what we do. As research-oriented documentation, the Archive of Digital Art, ADA, exists since the year 2000, growing into perhaps the most complex resource available online, a platform for scientific information and social communication. Hundreds of leading media artists are represented by several thousand documents, with more than 3,500 articles and a survey of more than 1,500 institutions. There are also more than 150 scholars and media art historians involved in making ADA a collective project. So the system offers a tool for artists and specialists to individually upload information about works and inventions. And over the last few years, some 5,000 artists were evaluated, resulting in the documentation of many of the most relevant artists of all continents. And now, ADA recently received, together with us, Art University Linz and Angewandte Vienna, 1.2 million euro grant to develop ADA into a research, and this is most important, a cost-free teaching tool for all art schools and key information resource for galleries and museums. Since the strongest limiting factor is the technological border pushed further by every new artistic invention, we document, as you see here, delimitations in art and science of the technological border. So new interfaces and displays and other inventions, artistic inventions, soft and hardware, configurations, literature, keywords and high-res visuals to allow the next generation of artists to learn with the best information, to give scholars the research resource they need, and museums, if they want to start a collection, the essential information. Overcoming the next limitation, the even so-called ghetto situation of digital arts, we created a new keyword system. Keywording can be bridge building too. Important innovations such as interface or genetic art were carefully selected from hundreds of publications and festival documentations, along with keywords, for example, from the Getty Art and Architecture Thesaurus that play a role in traditional art history, such as body or perspective. For this bridging thesaurus, new keywords are empirically selected to achieve a comprehensive overview of knowledge domain of media art, and this vocabulary is limited to around 400 terms. The idea is to allow artists and scholars themselves to do the keywording, so to overcome the limitations of a canonized vocabulary. The collective archive of digital art counts many digital art installations, and it is important to contextualize or dissolve them with media art histories, for example, the one of immersion, but we have also the histories of artificial life, the phantasmagoric imagery, automata, etc. There are hundreds of traditions, and through comparison we might better understand what is really new in digital art. So, the worldwide museum community, as we know, is more than 55,000 institutions strong. The US alone has more than 17,000, Spain hundreds with flagship institutions like Laboral and Reina Sofia. It may seem that this infrastructure, in all its diversity and history, is such a mighty monolith that drastic change would be difficult to imagine, but the digital age enters with force. It comes with its own digital-born arts and cultures, which have their own history. However, digital art is not collected systematically in a concerted strategy by museums, because the basic structures of the 240-year-old institution date back to a time when different artistic media prevailed. That is why we, as citizens, are facing massive limitations in terms of democratic discourse via contemporary digital art. So we, for example, together with 3 partner universities, we run an Erasmus Master of Excellence dealing with these topics in media art cultures to overcome, at least intellectually, those limitations. There are a number of scholarships, and if there are any students around here, invite them to apply for this program, which it brings people first to Austria, then to Denmark, Poland, then Singapore, and then also back to the European Union. Although in Europe, most museums are financed by our taxes, they can't fulfill their official task in the field of digital art. Comparing the worldwide budget for preservation of traditional art with electronic art, we understand how inadequate the support is, statistically almost immeasurable. A systematic preservation, and this is our proposal, maybe also for this discussion here, requires the cooperation of museums and libraries into specifically funded expertise networks. We can go back to that picture, or no? Okay, it's fine.
There is some problem with the...
How is it now? Better? Okay. So a systematic preservation, and this is my proposal, requires a cooperation of museums and libraries into specifically funded expertise networks. To achieve this, we need a concerted policy of collection and preservation in a much larger scale. So one strategy to enable the museum to fulfill its duties in our networked democratic societies would be the establishment of a concerted museum network of expertise and preservation. The faster this essential modification can be carried out, the smaller the limitations in cultural memory of the very early 21st century. Thanks.
Thank you very much for your presentation. You've talked a lot about archives and Media Artesaurus, the museum network of digital art, and okay. Ready? Okay. I was wondering if you can tell us what do you think about the role of archives, and also how can museums collect and preserve digital art, digital culture, and digital art? What would be a common practice that you see among the different institutions that you're involved in that you know really well?
So what we propose, and we just before Corona, we had a stakeholder meeting in Frankfurt in the National Library with people from the ministry and with leading artists and museum people and so on. And the idea is that we have a network of museums. The ministry said we can offer a seed funding like 11 million euro or so, and we have in total in Germany 700 art museums, and the idea is that we have maybe 5% of them, so 35 museums, for example, who would be part of this network. And the total of the network would guarantee that, for example, a museum in Hamburg, which is interested in a net art artwork, but does not necessarily have the expertise, but their colleagues in Bavaria may have, that they can ask them to build up this artwork and also to do the maintenance. And the opposite, people in Munich, for example, who would like to show an interactive artwork, who don't have the expertise, but they know in Hamburg they have the expertise, that they all work together in this network. So raising it to the next level. Since individual museums, as we know, they are mostly too small. They have maybe one or two curators, and they cannot deal with this big problem, with this big technological issue, and also not with the intellectual, in its total, with the intellectual issue. And so I think we need to put it on the next level to deal with this problem. But since so far, there's basically no museum which has a significant collection of the art of the last 30, 40 years, and all these big topics like climate and surveillance and migration and so on, where digital art is doing the good job in dealing with. They don't enter the museum, so the taxpayers in our democratic society, they don't have really the chance through art to think, to reflect on this kind of knowledge through the aesthetics. And I think we should change that. And in Germany and Austria and Switzerland, we try to develop that model.
And before I give the floor to José Luis, I want to ask you another question, and it's, do most of these museums upload their collection online to make it available for the public in general that cannot go and visit physically the museums?
Yeah, they upload their traditional art collection, so
Okay.
the drawings and paintings and so on. But since there are not significant digital art collections in major museums so far, it's also not documented online. So there are more these kind of, you call them archives, but actually they are more documentation databases, like this ADA I've presented earlier, or like the IZEA has one, or like the ZKM and I suppose Laboral and also some other institutions. This is more documentation showing museums what would be necessary to start a significant collection. And I think it's also very important that these survivors of these databases, some of them are quite old already, like 20 years, and sometimes they are the only remainings of documentation remainings of this art, since you cannot show the artwork since a long time anymore. So the archives, these documentation archives, are the only remainings, and it would be important that they work together in a worldwide network, and maybe also at the next IZEA we can work on this here in Barcelona, and and this would lift up, I think, the education at the art schools. It would give a better information resource for the galleries and for the museums. And this was also, together with this network of museums, it would help the art market to establish some maintenance systems for private collectors. Since now they are hesitant to buy a more advanced technological artwork, since they think it may be destroyed and they don't have the expertise to keep the maintenance.
There are a lot of intellectual property issues that my mind is thinking like very fast, because there are a lot of issues that you raised that have a lot to do with the limits that intellectual property sets up for the possibility of the museums to upload their collections if the right holders don't give them permission to. But I'll get to that later, because now I want to listen to José Luis de Vicente. Ahora paso al català, y tú vas a hacer tu explicación en castellano, però el presento en català. José Luis de Vicente, conegut per tots, és comissari investigador cultural que investiga l'impacte actual i futur de la innovació social i tecnològica a través d'artefactes, objectes i narratives que exploren escenaris socials i polítics emergents. Els seus projectes són de caràcter antidisciplinar, no interdisciplinar, molt relevant.
No lo he inventado yo, ¿eh?
¿No?
Ya me hubiera gustado. Pero...
Pues está muy bien y además te define. I creen contextos per la col·laboració i el diàleg entre l'art, el disseny, l'arquitectura i la tecnologia i la ciència, l'activisme, molt important, i totes les seves comunitats. Actualment, a part de fer moltes altres coses, és el comissari del Sonar +D, el Congrés de Cultura Digital i Tecnologies Creatives del Sonar, que és el festival de música conegut per tots també de Barcelona. A banda d'això, també és fundador i codirector de Tentacular, que és un nou festival de tecnologies crítiques i aventures digitals a Matadero, a Madrid, i forma part dels equips de programació de Llum BCN, i ha comissariat nombroses exposicions, entre les quals en destaco dos, que són Big Bang Data i Després del fin del mundo, que es van fer totes dues aquí al Centre de Cultura Contemporánea.
Gracias, Eva.
Te paso la
Generosa
palabra.
presentación. Gracias a todos por la invitación. I actually would prefer to do it in English for Oliver and Christian, but they asked me to do it in Spanish because of the audience, which is a bit frustrating because I wish I could speak two languages at the same time. I haven't still mastered that capacity. Así que pasaré al castellano. Voy a decir que me gusta mucho, aunque no sea fácil, el contexto de cómo hablamos en un evento como la Bienal de la Ciencia, porque estamos aquí en una tarima, sintiendo el aire, escuchando los petardos que anuncian ya San Joan, escuchando los pájaros a la vez que el flujo del tráfico. Es una situación donde ves a todas las fuerzas de la sociedad, algunas naturales, otras tecnológicas, algunas humanas, otras no humanas, luchando entre sí por alguna manera por llamar la atención, ¿no? Alguna gente ha llamado esto un wicked problem, un problema complejo, otra gente como Donna Haraway, la protagonista de la exposición que se está inaugurando aquí ahora mismo, como un ensamblaje.
José Luis, no hables tan rápido que no te podrán
Perdón,
traducir.
hablo muy rápido, lo siento, y todos los
Los
traductores de
intérpretes-
esta ciudad me odian. Por eso preferí hacerlo yo mismo. Como decía, quiero decir que esta situación, esta colisión de fuerzas naturales, tecnológicas, humanas, intentando imponerse, se la ha llamado en estudios de ciencia y tecnología muchas maneras distintas, con muchas imágenes o metáforas, ensamblajes, nudos. Yo ahora se me ocurría una palabra castellana que me sirve mucho, que es lío. Esto es un lío. Pues este lío en el que estamos aquí intentando imponernos a las fuerzas me parece muy representativo del espacio del que estamos hablando y las tensiones que estamos hablando cuando superponemos a las fuerzas de la tecnología y de la ciencia con las de la cultura, con las de la naturaleza, y pensamos en agentes mediadores que están intentando enhebrarlas de distintas formas y vamos a anudarlas en un lío, que es quizá la comunidad a la que pertenecemos y la que estamos hablando aquí hoy. Oliver ha hecho una magnífica cartografía, de alguna manera, de una historia de las relaciones entre arte, ciencia, tecnología y sociedad desde dentro de la historia del arte y desde dentro de la historia de la institución cultural y del museo, de alguna manera, como una tradición, una genealogía. Yo venía de alguna manera a contar que hay otros mundos que están también en este y hay otras tradiciones que están también en esta. Y entonces una de las cosas que a mí me interesan más de la relación en el trabajo entre comunidades artísticas, científicas y tecnológicas no es cómo son arte, pero cómo son también otras cosas además de arte y cómo pueden existir, por lo tanto, en espacios en el que la obligación de las disciplinas y de las instituciones las obligan a meterlos en unos cajones cerrados, ¿no? El que dice, por ejemplo, que ese edificio blanco a la que está dando la nuca es un museo de arte y el que está a vuestro lado es una casa de cultura y en la otra punta de la ciudad hay una de la ciencia. Y yo siempre he pensado que mantenemos estas cajas cerradas no porque sean necesarias, sino porque construyen de alguna manera formas de poder, formas de controlar recursos y formas de discurso. Uno a veces piensa que no hay disciplinas, solo hay instituciones, como manera de alguna manera de mantener estas paredes estancas. Yo creo que en 2021, a la salida de este año tan convulso en todas las dimensiones, que ha mostrado las formas en las que chocan un sistema productivo, una relación con las formas de vida más que humanas, unas formas de explotación que están exprimiendo los límites literales del planeta y nuestra necesidad de inventar sobre ellos otras formas de vivir. Este espacio de relación entre cultura, ciencia, arte y tecnología sobre todo puede ser y es un gran laboratorio de la sociedad. Es un espacio en el que podemos ensayar e imaginar otras maneras de vivir, pensar que hay otras formas de vivir que son posibles. Y esto es especialmente interesante en un momento en que esas otras maneras de vivir no son opcionales, no son una posibilidad utópica liberadora, son una necesidad imperiosa ante una imposibilidad, la imposibilidad de que nuestra manera de vivir sea prolongable en el tiempo, porque como todos sabemos, los números no salen, las cuentas no salen ya más. Así que en este espacio en el que relacionamos nuevas maneras de pensarnos en esta encrucijada, en este lío de todas fuerzas, la posibilidad de ensayar y de imaginar otras maneras de pensar cómo comeremos en un mundo en que la proteína ya no proceda de la ganadería extensiva, cómo viviremos en un mundo sin plástico, cómo respiraremos en un mundo con un aire a 600 partes por millón de dióxido de carbono de concentración, de qué manera existiremos en un mundo en el que, por ejemplo, las formas de explotación ya no hagan posible la seguridad alimentaria sobre la que nos hemos construido y que hace que todos demos por hecho un tomate. La idea de que la disponibilidad de un tomate en cualquier momento y cuando queramos no es un hecho del mundo que se pueda discutir. Todas estas cosas necesitan, yo creo, de unos espacios y de unos espacios seguros en los que realizar experimentos bajo circunstancias controladas. Y creo que de alguna manera esta comunidad se ha construido este espacio de producción cultural y de pensamiento en uno de estos espacios controlados sobre los que realizar estos experimentos bajo circunstancias que hemos definido y que podemos de alguna manera probar y permitir. Hay un género muy grande que muestra cómo cualquier historia de una implementación tecnológica que crea un modelo empresarial, que crea un nuevo modelo, una forma de explotación empresarial, muchas veces tiene precedentes en un laboratorio que tiene un pie en el territorio de lo científico y otro en el territorio de lo artístico, y cómo de alguna manera tenemos décadas de tradiciones de ensayar formulaciones. Pienso en el trabajo, por ejemplo, de laboratorios como Simbiótica, que planteaban los retos de la carne, la carne cultivada en laboratorio hace décadas, mucho antes de que esto fuera una posible solución a un mundo en el que la proteína animal tiene unos impactos medioambientales y morales que no son prolongables, y era un ejercicio de especulación de pensamiento social. Pienso también, por ejemplo, en la cercanía que toda una generación de artistas y diseñadores especulativos han tenido a nuevas formas de la ciencia que vienen a cambiar muchas cosas, pero de las que generamos el pensamiento antes de que se produzcan esos cambios, como por ejemplo la biología sintética, un ámbito en que la posibilidad de programar vida no solamente plantea aplicaciones industriales, sino que implica implicaciones éticas y morales que requieren de clases de preguntas que no son estrictamente científicas, que trasceden a esos límites. Por eso a mí me resulta interesante pensar cómo pensamos al trabajo de esta comunidad y a su impacto en el mundo fuera de los límites que definen estas cajas y dejando de preocuparnos por cuánto estas cajas nos archivan, nos contienen o cuentan nuestra historia, sino contando y entendiendo también que si los artistas hoy son una comunidad de investigación y de producción de conocimiento, de qué manera hablan, interactúan, se ensamblan, se entretelen, se lían con las otras comunidades de producción del conocimiento. Hubo un tiempo en que esto era relativamente especulativo y creo que lo interesante es que cada vez lo es menos. Es decir, el hecho de que, por ejemplo, en Estados Unidos se haya consolidado la terminología o la imagen de las disciplinas STEAM frente a las STEM, es decir, la idea de que las disciplinas que se entiende que generan mayores competencias más cualificadas con mayor impacto en el mercado laboral, que son la ciencia, la tecnología, la ingeniería y la matemática, se le incorpore la A de las artes, no porque las artes sean opcionales, sino porque generan dinámicas de diversidad, de nuevas formas de pensamiento, de otras formas de colaboración que reorganizan las relaciones entre estas cuatro disciplinas. Que de manera modesta, por ejemplo, en Europa la financiación de la investigación científica también empieza a incorporar la financiación de la investigación artística, con programas como el programa STARS de la Unión Europea o con iniciativas como la famosa ya y muy mencionada New European Bauhaus, que viene a decir que frente a la transformación de la economía europea en una economía verde, también tiene que haber un proceso de acompañamiento de alguna manera por parte de las comunidades creativas que sean capaces de crear también la estética y la política y una nueva moral de esta economía verde desde la creatividad y no solo desde la lógica empresarial o tecnológica. En este sentido, yo creo que una de las preguntas más importantes que nos podemos hacer hacia adelante es cuáles son las formas de las instituciones que habilitarán o que entenderán estas funciones de las comunidades artísticas que trascenden por encima la colección, el museo, la preservación de un legado y que requieren de nuevos indicadores, de nuevas formas de cambiar, digamos, o de impactar en el mundo. A mí me estimula mucho pensar que ya ahí fuera hay formas de práctica que están requiriendo de estos artefactos. La práctica, no sé, de algunos de los nombres más importantes en el mundo del arte contemporáneo hoy, como Forensic Architecture, un colectivo de investigación que de alguna manera utiliza museos, como este que tenemos detrás, en el que hizo una exposición, como contexto de presentación de su trabajo, pero cuyo trabajo tiene una fuerza de carga documental en procesos de violaciones de derechos humanos ante cortes internacionales, o en lenguajes como el periodismo de investigación. Me parece un caso muy interesante de ver cómo necesitamos pensar que hay formas de práctica hoy que desbordan cualquier posibilidad de crear estos límites rígidos. O exposiciones recientes como el trabajo colaborativo entre el artista Trevor Paglen y la investigadora académica en inteligencia artificial Kate Crawford en una exposición para la Fundación Prada en Milán, en el que investigaban los límites de una herramienta que es el conjunto de datos ImageNet, que se utiliza en sistemas de inteligencia artificial para reconocimiento facial y en el que se sospecha que hay incorporados sesgos que tienen potenciales discriminatorios en ámbitos como género, en ámbitos como raza. Este trabajo desbordaba los límites entre la exploración estética y la investigación académica y por lo tanto requería de estos espacios híbridos, estos espacios antidisciplinares para explicar que hoy en día la investigación artística, el desarrollo tecnológico, la investigación en aplicaciones de nuevas tecnologías y la investigación académica no existen ya más en esas carpetas separadas, en esas líneas súper limpias y súper fáciles de trazar que históricamente las han organizado.
Muchas gracias. Has hablado de muchas cosas. Me interesa tu concepción de lo que has dicho de, bueno, ¿por qué esto se llama Museo de Arte Contemporáneo? El del lado es una casa de cultura y tenemos un museo de la ciencia, ¿no? ¿Cómo te imaginas la institución ideal que puede albergar cualquier tipo de obra sin tenerla que encasillar en arte o en ciencia? ¿Qué tipo de institución sería?
Una de las cuestiones, por ejemplo, que tú sabes perfectamente, como por tu experiencia profesional también, es que cuando trazamos políticas culturales así, siempre somos conscientes de que no estamos reflejando necesariamente la naturaleza de las dinámicas o de las lógicas entre ámbitos, entre disciplinas, entre contextos, pero trazarlas así es profundamente problemático, tanto para la institución como para determinados núcleos que están profundamente asimilados, ¿no? Así que es muy difícil hacer un mapa, digamos, desde una lógica de políticas culturales, que al final es la que define estas dinámicas, que reconozca esa transversalidad. Y digo que es difícil porque llevamos 30 años tranquilamente intentando hacerlo y no nos acaba de salir. Con lo tanto, debe haber razones por ello. Pero creo que hay grandes oportunidades en que si tú, por ejemplo, dedicaras o pensaras que tenemos que hablar de clima, de la crisis climática, de la crisis de biodiversidad, es evidente que esa conversación no puede abordarse exclusivamente desde las ciencias naturales, desde las políticas energéticas, desde los modelos de producción alimentaria, desde ninguno de esos acercamientos nos situará en un sitio del que podamos abordar esas dimensiones. Con lo cual, a lo mejor, recuerdo que cuando hice la exposición Después del fin del mundo en el CCCB, aquí al lado, hará 3 años, a veces hablando de la exposición decía que era una exposición que quería entender que esto no era un centro de cultura contemporánea, sino un centro de crisis contemporáneas, y cambiar significado una C. Así que a lo mejor necesitamos instituciones para crisis, porque así no tendrán que responder a obligatorios disciplinares, ni tampoco a intereses sectoriales, que es otro agente muy importante así. Creo que la crisis climática no hay que bailarla, no hay que cantarla, no hay que pintarla, no hay que analizarla, hay que hacer todas estas cosas. Por lo tanto, a lo mejor es otra manera de pensarlo.
Sí, muy brevemente, antes de dar paso a nuestra tercera ponente de esta tarde. Las instituciones, no solo las plataformas de difusión, que son los museos, sino las instituciones que dan apoyo a los artistas y que dan subvenciones, también tendemos, que yo trabajo en una institución pública, a encasillar todos los proyectos creativos en hay departamentos de música, de artes visuales, de danza, de teatro, y esto es, yo pienso, profundamente negativo, ¿no? Y al final lo que hace es que cuando tú pones las subvenciones o los recursos que tienes para cada una de las disciplinas, hay muchas veces que nos encontramos en que no encajan hay proyectos que no encajan ni en una ni en ninguna y que por criterios de valoración no caben en ninguna de las disciplinas. Esto ya pasa en las artes en general, pero cuando son proyectos que son artísticos y científicos a la vez, esto se complica de una manera bestial, ¿no? O sea, los de las instituciones culturales decimos, uy, este proyecto no es mío, tienes que ir al departamento de ciencia, ¿no? Y los de ciencia dicen, uy, pero si tú eres un artista, tu formación es de Bellas Artes, ves a ver si hay algo que encaje en tu proyecto en el tema de las artes. No te pido que me des una solución de esto.
Estaba temblando porque pensaba que si yo tuviera la solución no estaríamos en este momento aquí.
Sí, sí, pero es una cosa que quería constatar. Vamos a dar paso ahora, ¿está la conexión lista? Para presentar a nuestra tercera ponente, que es Christian Paul. Christian, hello.
Hi, Eva.
Can you hear me?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, yes. Okay.
Perfect.
Thank you very much for being here virtually. You know, you have a big, you cannot see, but people are seeing you on a big screen, much bigger than our stage. And I'm going to introduce you to Christian Paul. I'm going to do the introduction in Catalan. You know your CV better than us, so this part I can do in Catalan, and then you can do your presentation, and I'm going to be asking you the questions that I have for you in English. La Christian Paul és una comissària d'art digital, És comissària en cap i directora del Centre de Disseny Sheila C. Johnson, I hope I pronounced that correctly, i és professora d'Estudis i Mitjans de Comunicació a The Nous School, que és una universitat que està a Nova York i a San Francisco, molt puntera, molt renovadora, molt bona, molt referent. També és conservadora adjunta d'art al Whitney Museum of American Art, que és el Whitney, un dels museus més importants de Nova York, i ha rebut diversos premis, entre ells el d'Escriptura Artística en Art Digital el 2016 de la Fundació Toma, i té diverses publicacions. Els llibres més importants són A Companion to Digital Art, del 2016, Digital Art, que té diverses edicions, l'última del 2011, i New Media in the White Cube and Beyond, del 2008. El Museu Whitney ha comissariat diverses exposicions que són molt referents en el seu camp, com Program, Rules, Codes and Choreographies in Art, era una visió històrica del 1965 al 2018, Corey Archangel, Pro Tools, el 2011, and Profiling, i és responsable d'Artport, que és el portal del museu sobre art a internet, que és molt referent en el món digital. I sense més dilacions, li donaré... You have the floor. Li donaré la paraula.
Okay, thanks so much for the generous introduction, Eva, and thanks so much for inviting me to this panel and for the excellent presentations, Oliver and Jose Luis. So as you all have pointed out, art, science, technology, and society cannot really be separated from each other. And I'm going to talk a little bit about institutional and organizational contexts in which they have been presented. I want to briefly outline definitions and taxonomies, histories, benefits and challenges, also the labs, initiatives and publications that have focused on sci-art, and finally exhibitions and institutional contexts. I want to start by making some things which seem obvious very clear. Of course, any kind of digital and new media art combines art and technology. Nevertheless, we have to make distinctions between artists as technologists, artists who are programmers, engineers, scientists, and work with the material, or artists working with technologists, artists who are focusing on concept and then hire programmers or kind of technologists who work with them. And then the true art-science collaborations, which are a subset of digital art, and we cannot equate all of those. Because that latter category, which I'm going to focus on a little bit more, really also works with scientific processes, reflects on them, and often involves complex collaborations. So we have a history for this participatory and technological art since the 1950s and 60s. I do not want to go into much detail here, but I think it is noteworthy that Bell Labs very early on in the 1960s basically encouraged collaborations between artists and technologists. And of course, we saw during that period also a lot of initiatives and movements that focused on computational principles, cybernetics, and kineticism, such as the Independent Group or GRAV, the Groupe de Recherche d'Art Visuel, and New Tendencies and the Systems Group. So we have a long history of these intersections already. And just a few examples, what you hopefully see here on the screen are a couple of works by Edward Inatovich. On the left, the Zenster, a work that ran from 1970 to 74 and was the first computer-controlled robotic sculpture. And then, of course, experiments in art and technology in the 1960s became a very prominent group with major exhibitions, and you see here a couple of images from OpenScore. So what has been much discussed in this field are the benefits and challenges of art-sci collaborations. Obviously, the digital age bridges, as Oliver has also pointed out, various gaps between art, technology, and science. The representation and ideas in art and science are constantly converging. So you have content as a flow of information. You encounter within those disciplines the mapping of data sets and issues of representation and simulation. What you also have in both art and science is the creation of a dialogue on interactions between the actual, virtual, and hypothetical. And I think that's something that both disciplines can really benefit from. And you also see hybrid practices and new forms of knowledge production. On the other hand, you have this cliche still of traditional definitions of objectives, meaning that science and technology are about validation of findings and objectivity, while art is non-scientific speculation and sensual and emotional. There may be some truth to both of these, but the reality, of course, is much more complex, and many of these gaps are bridged within those interdisciplinary collaborations. What is also very important and a challenge is to develop a language and vocabulary for these collaborations and to clearly define roles. That started becoming a problem in the 60s and at Bell Labs, for example, in those collaborations. Once again, without going into further detail, Kenneth Knowlton has famously written about this and his frustrations of collaborating with artists. I just recommend everyone to check this out because we still see many of these issues evolving. When it comes to really sci-art, we have seen most of that within institutional contexts, within universities and academia. For example, the Bio Art Lab at SVA. Symbiotica was already mentioned by José Luis, really focusing on wet sciences. So here you have artists embedded within a university lab. There have been programs such as the Swiss Artists in Labs, which ran until 2019, and of course many others. There have been initiatives such as ASCII in New York, founded in 1988, really focusing on these intersections between art and science, and very active, the Art Sci Initiative and Lab at the University of California at Los Angeles, run by Victoria Vesna, which really bridges talks and presentations with exhibitions and other explorations. And you also have many artist in residence programs, such as those at the SETI Institute. We also have seen from the 1960s onwards publications devoted to the subject. Of course, most famously, Leonardo, founded in 1968, but also ones such as Sci-Art magazine. So here you have basically a focus on that particular intersection. And I want to briefly mention in terms of exhibition history that it is notable that the Venice Biennial of 1986 was actually focused on art and art-science intersections. And in 2024, we're going to see the Pacific Standard Time exhibition by the Getty Foundation, which is a huge, huge initiative of exhibitions throughout California devoted to art and science. So all of the major players in the field will have developed exhibitions on the subject, which once again points to the prominence of all of this. And I want to end by briefly talking about two exhibitions and projects I've curated. The Question of Intelligence, which was a show focused on artificial intelligence and how it affects humanity. Without going into the works, I just want to clarify that this exhibition was not an art science exhibition per se, but as it was embedded within the New School as a university, I really had an academic environment to draw from and could present a different type of exhibition. So the structure of the show was also based on industry and science in that it focused on the automation of the senses in different areas. from vision to language and connected that to creativity. And then I want to end with my work at the Whitney, as Eva has pointed out. I have been curating the Artport website since 2019. And the last project that was launched there, the next biennial should be curated by a machine, was an AI project that once again was not meant as an art science project, but involved at least one really scientist researcher, Leonardo Impet, who worked with the Max Planck Institute in order to make this project happen. And it is basically an AI trained on the data sets of the Whitney biennials and the Liverpool biennials, since it was a co-commission with Liverpool, and tries to curate biennials by coming up with artist biographies and curatorial statements and reviews and press releases. Picking up on what Oliver has stated, just in closing, I want to point out that the Whitney Museum has collected digital art for quite some time, and for the past 4 years has a digital art acquisition committee that I'm spearheading that brings work into the collection. We have also had a media preservation initiative that is concluding its first phase this year, which has built a network of institutions that are sharing knowledge. And I believe that we are very well equipped to preserve digital art in general. A lot of work has been done for the past 20 years in terms of best practices. What still is the biggest issue for me is collecting the work, bringing it into collections, and making a commitment to its preservation. And I'll end it here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Christiane. That was a very interesting presentation. I just want to explain to you that if you hear something like a bomb coming off, it's because San Juan, which is a very traditional celebration here, it's very close. It's in June 24th, and what people do is just fireworks everywhere, and people get excited because it's starting to feel like summer, and we have people like throwing off fireworks just around the corner from here. So if you see us going like this, it's because of that.
Thank you.
Thank you for your presentation as an expert on art and law, and specifically intellectual property issues in contemporary art and contemporary creation. One of the things that came in mind to me when you were talking about the artificial intelligence exhibition is that the law is not prepared for these kinds of works. In other words, intellectual property law recognizes a work protected by IP only when there is a human that is taking decisions on the final form. In other words, the ideas are not protected, the expressions of the ideas are protected. And if there is a machine that is creating a work and you don't have a control over what's the final work, about how the final work is going to look like, then this work can be copied because intellectual property work, it's not going to protect it. So this is an interesting issue that I'm just bringing up, not to ask you a question, but just to point out that if the law is always behind when there are social changes, imagine how behind it's going to be with the artistic changes and artistic innovations. Having said that, I just wanted to ask you you pointed out how important it is for you, the presentation, collection, and the preservation of the artworks. How do you preserve an artwork or a work of art, science, technology when it's the institution that produces this work and then there is no original? In other words, you have an idea as an institution, and then you produce it. You have a screen, you have a computer, you have whatever you need to show to make tangible this work so people can perceive it and understand it. And then once the exhibition is over, and you don't have to preserve that actual work because it's not what you see, it's the idea, the interesting part of the work. How do you preserve that?
Well, that's a complex issue. Let me make a few more distinctions here. First
Okay.
of all, the work of art obviously not consists within the display mechanisms and the screens on which we perceive it and view it, but it is an original work of art that exists as, let's say, software with components, etc. So if we commission this work or bring it into the collection, it's a complex process of artist questionnaires. So every artist receives questionnaires from the start. We identify components in order to make the preservation strategies easier. We also have been working for the past few years as part of the Media Preservation Initiative with New York University, the Computer Science and the Institute of Fine Arts, and they have been doing code analysis and basically assisting us with the preservation of work. So there is a whole mechanism in place for dealing with the work. And once again, most important is here the software and the components of the work rather than the display mechanism, which will change, and the work will need to be migrated on that basis. So I think for institutions, it's important to really have procedures in place. Obviously, this is different if you're just putting up an exhibition and you do not own the work, but you loan it for a show and you return it to the artist. In that case, obviously, there's no commitment to the preservation.
Okay, clear enough. I don't know if you have questions for Christiane?
I have a question actually for both of you. So first, and I thank you very much, Christiane. I enjoyed your talk very much. A great overview. Also the structure, fantastic. I also agree. Of course, there was lots of fantastic research done on preservation. But I think now there's a time for a systematic approach, for a systematic use of that, and in a larger way. And so, but going back to the art and science. Theoretical question, and so if we go back into history, into Renaissance, for example, the separation was not there as to that extent. It was called ars, and so those two fields even did not really exist as a separation. Also, the museum before it all came together in the Wunderkammer, and then there was this development of the hard sciences, so to say, over time. And in the 60s, Leonardo and others came up with this utopia to bring these two seemingly different fields together. And I wonder what you, both of you, Jose and Christiane, what do you think on these artistic research programs which were developed over the course of the last 10, 15 years, especially in Europe, I assume also in the US. So will this lead again to a separation or to an enrichment maybe of arts? Will we develop hard arts, or as like we develop hard humanities and the digital humanities, so using digitally driven humanities, and on the other side we have these sciences which become more and more creative, also visually. And if you look for the art magazine, I would even say art magazines, for the science magazines like Science or Nature, they look like art magazines nowadays. So is there a new separation, but enriched by these seemingly different fields? Especially for you.
Go.
I don't know if yeah. Okay, I'll get started, since I can't see both of you. So you're absolutely right, Oliver. I think the separation actually occurred centuries ago, and it has been a very long process of ultimately conceptualizing and intellectualizing art and science in different ways. As I try to point out, I think they have come a lot closer again through new technologies because there have been increased intersections. At the same time, as you are saying, you still have science magazines that look like art magazines existing very separate from the art world. But I think now is a moment of increased dialogue and potential for bridging those gaps. One very banal thing that comes to mind here is that my exhibitions and program, for example, and also earlier works are the only ones, I believe, within the Whitney Museum that have received reviews in Scientific American, for example.
Wow.
And I have been on the Science Friday broadcast of National Public Radio here. That's typically not what happens for my colleagues. So, and it is a great example of this type of art bridging out, and also the foundation support that programmed my last exhibition at the Whitney received was, for example, from the Sloan Foundation, who typically invest much, much more in the science technology side. So I think those are great examples of bridging the gap a little bit.
I'll be very brief because I know we're doing short on time, but I think that one of the questions that I was thinking as you were formulating the question is to what extent the hyper-specialized complexity of technical knowledge today makes that old paradigm in a way irreproducible. You know, we just cannot go back to a before because the way that scientific knowledge and technical knowledge is produced today is radically different. So in that difference, you know, in the embedding of cultures of research that may also be evolving in a way or changing in a way the limits, the contours of where they operate, we may produce a humanistic culture that also in a way has to transcend those limits. Or so I wish. This is my utopian, I imagine, projection on top of this, because of course this in the end is very much determined by politics of funding, politics of actually how do you determine value and what is valuable, you know. But I don't know, when I, for instance, in industry, I remember like this piece of news that I thought was very graphic of how artificial intelligence voice assistants would require of poets and playwrights because they rely on understanding things like irony and sarcasm, which are very much things that cannot be understood if it's not from the context of the humanities. I had like a little light of saying like, well, maybe there's a world out there where that embedment, you know, of technical knowledge and expertise in sarcasm and irony produces a different kind of culture. Yeah.
Yeah. I think we only have a couple of minutes left, right? Since there is the picture. Do you have a little bit more time? I don't know if anyone in the audience wants to ask any question for any of the panelists.
¿Puedo hacer la pregunta en español?
Pots parlar amb el que vulguis.
En castellano, perdón.
Hi ha traducció simultània amb el que et surti.
Bueno, yo tengo una pregunta, ahora estoy un poco intimidada. Tengo una pregunta que es en general para los tres, con esta cuestión que creo que todos abordaron sobre la relación y la distancia o la conjunción entre arte y ciencia y tecnología. Y mi pregunta es si no debería ser abordado como un problema epistemológico, como de formas de conocer, más que como áreas establecidas desde esa epistemología puntual, que es un devenir, digamos, del modernismo como mutado hasta el día de hoy, ¿no? Pero si no podría tal vez pensarse desde un lugar como más abstracto, más por detrás, que en definitiva une estas tres prácticas, digamos, y creo que, no sé, a mí me hace pensar en las instituciones también como que todo parte de una epistemología muy puntual que es la occidental y moderna, ¿no?
Sí. Pues es muy directa, sí.
I'm going to ask you to be very brief. Did you get the translation of her question?
Almost, yeah.
Okay. Sí, ¿algo más que añadir?
No, yo estoy básicamente, quiero decir, la pregunta es válida y la tesis creo
es muy relevante.
Es muy válida, efectivamente. Sí.
Sí, sí. You want to add something to that?
I would say the question was right on in pointing out that it is, I believe, an epistemological issue that is at the heart of this, and that has really led to the gap over the centuries, as a matter of fact. And it seems to be a good strategy to also approach it as such in this point and think more closely about knowledge production within these fields.
Thank you very much. I think we're going to have to leave it here. And thank you, Oliver, Cristiane, and José Luis to be here, and to Pau and to Bienal de la Ciencia for inviting us, and to all of you for being here. Thank you.
Thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you very much, Cristiane.
Thank you.